Hello everyone, Alan Sands here, and welcome to this segment on arms control and disarmament. What we're going to do in this segment is we're going to look at the basics of arms control and disarmament agreements, look how treaties are designed and how they are implemented, and then talk a little bit about some of the motives behind arms control and some of the problems behind arms control. Okay, let's go. So here are the learning objectives for this segment. When we're done, you should be able to define arms control and disarmament. You should be able to describe how arms control agreements are made. You should be able to explain the motive for arms control treaties, and you should be able to explain the general problems facing arms control efforts. So, arms control and disarmament, at their very root, seek to establish restrictions upon the development, the production, the stockpiling, the proliferation, and the use of weapons. Any kind of weapon. And there are many arms control agreements in the world today covering all sorts of different types of weapons systems. Obviously, we're going to be focusing on nuclear weapons. And first of all, though, we've got to make an important distinction between arms control and disarmament. So disarmament efforts seek to either drastically reduce or eliminate categories of weapons. Disarmament essentially is about abolition. It's about the abolition of certain types of weapons. Arms control efforts, in contrast, are about efforts to reduce stockpiles of weapons or restrict their use. So when we talk about nuclear disarmament, we are talking about a country or all countries eliminating or abolishing nuclear weapons. When we talk about nuclear arms control, we are talking about reducing the number of weapons or placing some kinds of restrictions on their deployment, on their use, or maybe on their testing, for example. Now, arms control and disarmament is achieved through diplomacy between states. States negotiate agreements in the form of international treaties. So any treaty or agreement is the result of what was politically possible in negotiations. And this is really important because so often we look at treaties and we go, oh my God, my goodness, how totally inappropriate or how inadequate to the task this treaty is. But we have to respect the fact that that is what was possible politically. That is what the states that were involved in the negotiations could agree on at that time. And that's an important piece because ultimately this comes down to what can be achieved through diplomacy. Participating states that sign treaties are called signatories to a treaty. They become parties to a treaty when they have ratified, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, let's take a quick look at an example just to illustrate what we're talking about here conceptually. So here we have a group of states in a system, and let's say that a group of them decide to get together and create a treaty, an arms control treaty, let's say. So let's say it's this group of countries right here. And this group of countries then comes to the negotiating table and they decide they are going to create the international treaty Abacada. And that's not very inspiring, of course, but we're just going to stay at an abstract level here. And so the states meet, they sit down, and they say, look, can we all agree to restrict the number of a type of weapon system that we all have so that each of us is only allowed to have 5 of these weapon systems? And they can talk for a while, and then maybe they're able to achieve an agreement on that. And maybe not, in which case they all go home and there's no treaty. But let's say they do, these 5 countries, Abacada, and they draft the treaty, and they all sign the treaty. So what we have then is we have 4 signatories to the Abacada Treaty, A, B, C, and D. And the job then of each of these countries is to make sure that in the future they abide by the terms of the treaty. And that will mean that each one of them is only allowed to have 5 of this particular kind of weapon system. States E and F are not parties to the treaty. They weren't part of the negotiations. They weren't involved. They can have as many of those weapons as they want. If State E wants to join Abacada and make it Abacada, which is terrible, but anyway, let's just roll with it, then they can accede to the treaty and sign it, and then they will become a signatory to the treaty as well. And that would leave just F outside the treaty in this particular example. F could come in later itself, of course, if it wanted to. So that's the basic idea of the process. But we're not done yet. And we're not done yet because for treaties to go into force in international law, they've got to be ratified. And they have to be ratified by all of the signatories or some majority of the signatories. And that is usually specified in the treaty itself. The ratification process involves each signatory to the treaty taking the treaty home to its own parliament and passing it in its own domestic legislature. And if it is passed in its own domestic legislature, what that means is that that treaty has now been passed in the domestic law of that country. And it is then and only then that a signatory state to a treaty becomes a full party to the treaty, because they have ratified it. And if you get enough of those ratifications, depending on what the treaty specifies, then the treaty will enter into force when the requisite number of states have ratified the treaty in their domestic legislatures. So for example, in Canada, if Canada signs an international arms control treaty, let's say, the government will bring it back here to Canada's Parliament, to our House of Commons. And the House of Commons will have a vote. And of course, if it's a majority government, it should pass easily with strict party discipline in Canada. And therefore, Canada will be a signatory to this treaty and a party to it. It will have ratified that treaty in the domestic legislature of Canada, the House of Commons. If it's the United States, it'll be Congress what would have to vote. And once that happens, then the United States will be a party to that treaty. So why arms control? What are the motives to do this? Well, there are a lot of motives, actually. And so advocates of arms control are very energetic, they're very passionate. They believe very strongly that arms control is a very effective instrument for dealing with the security dilemma that we talked about earlier in the course. So what arms control can do for you is that it can reduce the frequency of war by eliminating certain types of very threatening, very destabilizing weapon systems. It can obviously reduce or prevent arms races, right? In our example, if all of those countries agree to restrict the number of a certain type of weapon system to 5 each, and they all abide by that, they've just prevented an arms race. So they've really achieved something. They've reduced instability and hostility, and they've also saved themselves a lot of money, presumably. And it's that third point, saving financial resources. Arms races are expensive, so you don't spend a lot of money on weapon systems if you've successfully negotiated an arms control treaty. Finally, you can build trust, and you can promote the peaceful resolution of conflict through arms control, because arms control kind of builds trust in this anarchic international system where there isn't much trust. And finally, if war does break out, there's a very good chance that you will limit its destructiveness in some way because you've restricted the number of weapons of a certain type that are available to the combatants. So for all these reasons, arms controls generally seem to be a good thing. But there are many problems with arms control, and so critics of arms control say, well, hold on, that sounds great, but the reality is somewhat different. First of all, there's a problem of trust. How do we really trust other countries to abide by arms control agreements? And that means that we need to be able to ensure compliance. And that means we have to be able to verify compliance with the treaty. Is everyone actually abiding by the terms of the treaty? And how you verify whether another country is actually abiding by the terms of the treaty is very complicated, and states generally don't like to talk about verification because they think it's intrusive, they think it could be spying, so that's a real big problem. Then you have the problem of outright cheaters. I mean, countries that sign treaties but then violate them. North Korea is a good example of that. They signed the NPT but then proceeded to violate the terms of the treaty by acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. Then there's the concern that treaties will be violated in times of crisis or war. The reality that if weapons can be built, even if you dismantle them and control them, they can be built again. So the knowledge is never lost. It's always there. So there's always that worry. There's always a concern that new technology might render a treaty obsolete or ineffective. And finally, there's a big political problem. Arms control agreements only bind their signatories. They don't bind non-signatories. So if you're a state and you don't sign a treaty, you are not bound by its provisions. And that's been a big problem with nuclear weapons, as we shall see. Okay, so now you should be able to define arms control and disarmament. You should be able to describe how arms control agreements are made. You should be able to explain the motive for arms control treaties and identify some of the general problems facing arms control efforts. Okay, so that's the story, conceptually, of arms control and disarmament. And what we're going to build on in class is bringing that conceptual discussion into the actual nuclear weapons arms control and disarmament agreements and treaties that have been made by states. And I'm looking forward to that because it's actually a really interesting discussion. We'll see you soon.